Hi, everyone. This is our last class over readings. We have one more after this, but this class is focused on taking your research design that you have been working on and planning and how you can turn that design into a strong and cogent proposal. So synthesizing your framework, your questions, your methods to produce a top-notch proposal. So thinking about how we can bring all of those elements together to have a persuasive proposal within the structure that's appropriate for whatever type of proposal you're doing. Thinking about designing your proposal in a way that you're able to articulate it as an argument about your study in terms of not only its significance, but also the coherence of your design and the feasibility of your design. That your proposal demonstrates your ability to not only craft a strong design, but to evaluate the alignment between your research questions, conceptual framework, methods, and that you're able to engage in this. And how you can see this as a process and a point to engage in reflection in terms of what led you to the point you are at now. So let me add in my animation. So just like we've been talking about all semester in these chapters, you will see the proposal as positioned as not a description or summary of what you are going to do, but an argument for what your work is, why it's important, why you're the one to do it, and how you will go about carrying it out. So Maxwell, this chapter is particularly strong. So make sure you do a good read of Maxwell chapter 7. I think you'll find it really helpful. So he starts off by arguing that the purpose of your proposal is to explain what it is you want to do and justify your study. So explaining has to do with it being coherent, clear, having all the necessary components, and then not just explaining what you're doing, but offering the justification, not only what you're going to do, but why you made that decision. So all about everything we've been talking about all semester, giving a rationale to explain your decisions and your choice to make clear why you are doing it that way. So Marshall similarly talks about making a documented argument, and instead of just saying what it is, that it should and it can be done, and you're the person to do it. You will also see in this reading that the proposal is, of course, a plan. It's written in future tense, like we've talked about. And since it's qualitative design, it's not a contract, but it is recognizing that this is a flexible design and that it will be iterative, and making sure that you include that and how and when you are going to deal with that when that comes up. So when you are crafting this strong argument, some of the things to remember: clarity, avoiding jargon, even when you are going into developing your expertise. There might be areas that members of your committee are not an expert on, so making sure you are clear about that. You have coherence, you have a logical flow from idea to idea. You're linking them together using things like road mapping, your transitions to connect them together, and constantly building that argument. Relevance, keeping it tight, focused on your study, what it is and why, what it is and why. Transparency, making sure that you are demonstrating ethics and your stance of trustworthiness, even in the proposal, by acknowledging limitations in the ethical issues, validity threats, and make sure that you are delimiting, talking about the scope of your study, what you're focused on, and what you're not. I loved this quote that Maxwell includes. This is not original to him, but advisors and reviewers misunderstand student proposals far more than they disagree with what is proposed. So thinking about this again goes into the clarity and the coherence, deciding what is the most logical way to introduce all of your information. And so you have the benefit, you have done all the mini memos, you've thought about all of these different aspects. Your job in a proposal is to link those things together in a way that your argument for your study naturally unfolds, and you try to anticipate and mitigate any potential misunderstandings that could happen. So yeah, keep that in mind. Where might this be misunderstood? And if that happens, understanding that it could be not that it's a disagreement, but rather you weren't clear enough or you need to explain further. So Maxwell offers up this version. He argues, of course, that his um, interactive research design approach will pair beautifully with the proposal. And so here he visually, true to fashion, maps out how that will come up and what those different components will be. What I really like about this chapter is he talks directly about prospectus chapter 1, 2, and 3. So I think that you will find this helpful even, and he also is very inclusive to what different committees might expect or ask for, and helps you tailor what you have already done in terms of crafting this design to make your proposal fit the requirements that you might have. So in your proposal, of course, you'll have your abstract. Now, the goals are the big part of your introduction, where you're introducing your core constructs, what the goals of your study is, what the overall context of your study is, and the research issue. Also, you're starting to, in the introduction, you kind of do a mini introduction to a lot of things, a mini introduction to who you are, your relationship to the research, what your design is going to be. A general introduction to your research questions might be included in there. And in the text, he goes into depth about that. Then the conceptual framework, and this section I think is particularly strong because he talks about his argument for chapter 2 being a conceptual framework as opposed to a literature review. But if you have questions about how to write a strong literature review, he really gives a lot of important considerations when he talks about conceptual frameworks there. So I think you'll find that helpful. What I liked that he mentioned about research questions is you're not in a proposal, you're not just listing your research questions, you should list them, but then give a detailed discussion about the research questions and how you landed on those questions, why those are your research questions, and how they help frame your analysis to potentially and hopefully illuminate what it is you're hoping to see in those goals. The description of setting, that could go in a few different places. He puts it here, but then also research methods. I think description of setting goes here, introduction, and it goes again in methods. So I think that in your introduction, you can give a general introduction to the setting, and then in the methods, when you're going through selection, you can go into the specifics. So the methods, he has some really nice considerations, as does Marshall as well, about some headings and what you need to make sure that you include there. And of course, validity, that we have learned about most recently. So when you're talking about the purpose of your of each part, I don't know what happened with my spelling here, but introduction helps others see why your study matters, not just to you, but the field. And this is also you introducing what it is, contextualizes your topic, significance, rationale for why it should be done, framing the research questions, particularly around those core constructs. Conceptual framework, and this is Maxwell's take, but again, there he has helpful considerations depending on the type of literature review or conceptual framework section you are doing. An argument for how the literature informs your study and also how the theory frames your study. Thinking about relevance, connecting what's known to what you plan to learn. And there's different approaches to literature review, but I agree with Maxwell's argument that literature review, instead of being a comprehensive review of everything about it, should be a way for you to enter the conversation and for you to use the literature as a springboard for not only calling for your study, but helping you make sense of the data that you collect. So what is already known, what's missing, how does your study fill that gap? And in this section, you can introduce your positionality in terms of your research or positioning, how you relate to the research issue. And again, making it much more detailed than just who you are, but going into the assumptions that you make about the topic, your history with your topic, the background with the topic, your personal connection to the research, why it is you chose it, so on and so forth. Research questions being the heart of your proposal. Remember, Maxwell puts them right there at the center. He argues they should be tightly connected to the goal, theory, and methods. So that should be a clear link. And instead of just giving your list, make them clear, focused, and justified. So providing that not only list of your questions, but a detailed description and justification of why those are the appropriate questions. In the methodology and research design overall approach. So he has some helpful framing on what you might want to write there, participant selection or site selection, data collection, how and why it's going to be carried out, your data analysis, which we have just come off doing a detailed memo about. So your explicit plan, if you're using software, so on and so forth, ethical considerations, which was our last class, and defending the particular methods that you are going to be using to demonstrate research quality or validity or trustworthiness. And again, you are going to be using your sites to defend and help justify your choice. So that might be helpful too when you're thinking about how do you justify these decisions with your methodological citations and your personal explanations as well. Why these methods? How will they yield valid, useful insights? How do you plan to manage bias? And of course, having that dedicated section and anticipate and address threats. Here are some of the strategies that we talked about that you might want to include in your proposal. And then in your proposal, you'll have a conclusion section, your so what, where you're tying together your goal, significance, and the potential contribution of this study, where you can really drive home your argument for why this study needs to be done in the way that you've laid out, why it matters. Now, this is helpful too. Make sure you check this out. Of course, you'll have your references, but then you will likely have your appendices. And depending on your particular study, Maxwell has a list of some of the things that you might want to consider. Some of the things that I think are great to have there, especially in a prospectus, are your interview protocol, focus group protocols, maybe even your recruitment materials. If you are hoping to include that in IRB, might as well do it there as well. Some of your visuals that you might have. I prefer for visuals to be embedded in the proposal, but you might, depending on to what extent you are following APA citations, you might have your tables there, your matrices to map out your research questions with the data collection sources. You might have your research design map there. You might have your conceptual framework there. You might have your phases of data analysis there. There's a lot of different examples for appendices. And so make sure you check that out and you think about how you might put that in there as well. And I didn't put the visual here from Maxwell, but this is something that we've been using all semester. The chapters 1 and 2 are you're framing the what your study's about and why it should be done. And then chapter 3 is articulating how you are going to carry it out. So Maxwell, I love this. Maxwell has a really great exercise for you to engage in to create an outline before or in the revision process of your proposal that is helping to craft it as an argument and really establish the design logic that is necessary to write a really strong proposal. So he has this exercise 7.1. It starts on page 204. This quote is kind of underscoring why going through a process like this is helpful. Make sure all the parts are properly in place before tightening. Like bolts, car metaphor, I guess, or engineering. So this is not an example of the protocol. You can take a look at that, but this is an example of what the outline might look like for a study. So you can see the title is here, and the proposal writer is starting off with their arguments. This is going all the way back to our first class session when we were writing arguments for our study. But this is taking those arguments all the way through, not just your conceptual framework and your goals, but throughout each part. So here you can see these are the arguments for the goals. And then these are the arguments that are going to help link the components of the conceptual framework in the literature. So if you take a look, you will see that. Now here, this is the argument that is framing the research questions. Propose basic science teachers to understand. These are the arguments for the methods about participant selection and selection. These are the arguments to frame data collection. So definitely look at this example to see some of the language, the phrasing, and how you can adapt that. Argument for how they plan to analyze the data, and argument for how they will establish validity. So I think that this would be a really helpful exercise to go through to ensure that your proposal is aligned. I want to also give you some suggestions from Ravitch about, this is in chapter 11 of her book, about how to ensure that you have an aligned design. So we've been looking at those alignment matrices throughout the semester to ensure that your questions, methods, and analysis support one another. So you might do some of those that might even be included in an appendix. Marshall gives an advice about preparing for questions during your defense. I have another slide about that. Here are some examples here that you might want to think about. And in your proposal, this is a great opportunity to really embrace the strengths of qualitative research as a method of putting forth rich contextualized understanding, centering multiple perspectives, a call for complexity, contributing to both theory and practice. And of course, like I mentioned too, in your proposal, this is your opportunity to cite relevant and high quality studies and show that you are entering the conversation of the tradition and continuing on. In writing your proposal, you should also be thinking about how you will defend your proposal, particularly at the prospectus phase, defending your prospectus. So Marshall gives some great suggestions on this, and how you might engage in a mock defense with critical friends. I think that you should also write your own questions that might be posed to you in your defense, and you should also practice. You should practice giving your defense, videotape yourself, do it for friends, or videotape yourself, videotape yourself, videotape yourself. Even if you don't watch back the videotapes, the act of pressing play and going through it start to finish helps you practice presenting your proposal. Again, remember that quote, it's more often that you're misunderstood rather than disagreed with. So practicing is a great way to combat that. Also, think of your own questions that you might get asked and practice responding to them. That will just get you in the habit of talking about your research in a way. So Marshall has sample questions on page 271 and 272. So if you are getting close to that, you might use some of these questions. And she has some of these questions here. These are more so from people who are not from a qualitative lens. So final thoughts as you're moving from design to your proposal. It's all about translating your careful, reflective planning into a clear, persuasive document, situating it as an argument to the world about why your study matters and how it will be done well and why that's the way to do it. So being clear, honest, rigorous, show how everything aligns, giving those justifications, giving that rationale, supporting it with cites. And it's not just about getting approval, but becoming really ready to conduct a study that truly contributes to knowledge and fully addresses your goals while honoring and respecting participants. So I know you can do it. So as far as your mini memo, you might engage in the outline that is 7.1, but I would also really like for you to reflect on your progress this semester. So thinking back to where you started on June 9th or beginning of June, think about everything that you have learned. So I would like for you to write about your areas of most growth, what you have learned the most about in terms of research design, be it conceptual frameworks, research questions, methodology, validity, the areas that you want and need to continue developing, maybe an area that you feel unsure, or you want to deepen your skills or confidence, what you're most excited for next, what part of your study you're most excited to do, and what your next steps are in refining your proposal and preparing for data collection. So I look forward to seeing your memo. This is going to be the last mini memo. So I am excited to read and respond as you think about all of your progress.